Book 2 of Avatar holds a quite unique position. It is neither set up like Book 1, nor the climax like Book 3. Instead, it is filled to the brim with incredible and super character-rich episodes almost back-to-back. The Blind Bandits, Zuko alone, and I mean it has Tales of Ba Sing Se, need I say more? But even standing amongst those giants, I still believe that the single most important episode of Book 2 is actually the library. And funnily enough, this has only become more true with every single new Avatar story that we get. The episode opens with the gang's usual antics, but Sokka says that they need to start making plans and gathering intel on the Fire Nation. At this point in the story, we know that Ozai needs to go down before the comet arrives, and Aang has learned at least the basics of earthbending. So with the gang having very little hope of finding a firebending master, now it is full steam ahead to just bringing down Ozai. There really are no other side quests. At this point, it is just, we need to bring him down ASAP. And of course, Sokka being the one to understand the importance of information in this conflict, very much continues that trend of him being a wacky goofball, while in reality, he is incredibly intelligent.
You're a genius!
To him, this isn't just about training or even gathering allies. No, it is preparation and knowledge that he keeps stressing. In the Northern Air Temple, we already saw the dangers of technological and informational symmetry. That is what Sokka wants to wield against the Fire Nation. And so with that, after a few more goofs and gaffs, they pick out their vacation settings, which then takes us to the Misty Palms Oasis. We'll get to this plenty more later in the episode, but it's already here where we see the sort of externalities of the Fire Nation's war machine. Aang describing it as,
"It's one of nature's wonders,"
is just another goofy example of Aang thinking that the world hasn't really changed that much while he was taking his very, very long nap, but I think it also perfectly demonstrates how the priorities of society shifted during wartime. Back in Kyoshi's day, that sad-looking ice thing was a full-blown iceberg. And while the town was still inhabited by some less than savory individuals, it also boasted some of the most diverse and curious people the world had to offer, all in search of Wan Shi Tong's library. Once the war started, however, lots of the soldiers you'd expect in these parts were pulled to the actual conflict areas. And so, slowly but surely, the town was mostly overtaken by the Si-Wang tribes and the illegal trade. More on that in a bit. We then see the gang meet up with Professor Zape, who introduces us to the titular library. He talks about how the legends describe it as this mystical place that was built for people to better themselves. As we'd see throughout the story, though, that didn't really last. But what I always loved about this episode is the journey to this lost library itself. Forgotten knowledge and the journey for said forgotten knowledge is a relatively common trope in fiction, but I absolutely love how that is presented in Avatar.
No harm ever came from reading a book.
The thing with this kind of just fictional lore is that if you just randomly reveal stuff, there is a very, very good chance that none of it will really hit. It's just a lore dump that comes out of the blue, right? And this is doubly true for information that would play some sort of pivotal role in the rest of the narrative, as actually we'd see here. If Sokka were to just randomly stumble upon some prophet yapping about the eclipse, chances are that reveal would be nowhere near as memorable as this journey into the desert, for the simple reason of it just feeling kind of unearned. It wouldn't quite be like a Deus Ex Machina since it's not really some last moment clutch, but it would definitely feel as if it was just handed to us on a silver platter. And that is what makes things quite complicated. If you want to convey how a character is getting stronger physically, well, you just add a good old training montage and you're mostly covered. But how do you do that when you need to convey earning pieces of crucial information? Watching a character read a book for 3 episodes certainly doesn't sound like a ton of fun now, does it? So how about you make them go on this whole journey and spend days just searching for that book instead? And that is what makes this entire journey so interesting. It is the setting itself that almost becomes a character constantly reacting to the gang's actions. From the obvious like Wan Shi Tong and the Sandbenders to a lot more dubious things like the Si-Wang Rock. Everything we see becomes that information version of a almost training arc. This entire trek throughout the deserts, it is just a visual showcase of that learning. But wait a minute, don't they just fly all the way over there? Yes they do, hold on, let me cook. As we finally reach the library, the series swings right back into that weird surreal mysticism. Something that is easily one of my favorite aspects of The Last Airbender, and one of my least favorite aspects of Korra. Yes, I had to sneak in a little Korra diss there because it really makes me sad. We first see one of the knowledge seekers just appear from somewhere and casually run up the side of the library, which is already that's cool, but what? And then Toph, sensing this impossibly large library being almost completely buried in sand, really hammers home that sense of this hidden ancient knowledge deep in this almost otherworldly structure. Much like with the Southern Air Temple, the architecture here deliberately emphasizes that endless stretch into the abyss. Just like the Avatar cycle, the depths of this library are meant to seem almost infinite. And that is demonstrated beautifully as we meet Wan Shi Tong himself. Just to state my bias right up front, Wan Shi Tong is, if not my favorite spirit in the franchise, then definitely up there right alongside Ko and Glowworm for the simple reason of him being the perfect representation of what I think spirits should represent. That said, the title of He Who Knows 10,000 Things sounds menacing, but it's actually implying that he is incredibly dumb. 10,000 things is not a lot of things. Even looking at something as basic as language, the average person knows 20,000 words. So yes, if this title is accurate, you, yes you, know multiple orders of magnitude more things than Wan Shi Tong, the all-knowing spirit. But okay, goofs aside, the spirits we see in Avatar are almost akin to old godlike figures. Each abiding by their own rules, their own desires, each pursuing different goals, and each having their own personality. Sure, there is a wacky, goofy meditating baboon, but there are also spirits like Ko, who are so old that their perception of human life is entirely skewed to the point of not even really distinguishing between Kuruk and Aang, because hey, it's the same spirit, right? And so when we meet Wan Shi Tong, I think there's immediately the sense of foreboding, because this spirit is meant to be not just powerful in its own domain, but quite literally all-knowing. The library was first described as a place for people to better themselves, but right away there is a trade that must take place. Information for information. And so just like with Ko, who was meant to be an antagonistical force but still ends up helping Aang, Wan Shi Tong too serves this ambiguous role of providing information, but also putting great emphasis on how that information is to be used. It's a totally emotionally detached, almost enlightened point of view where information is a almost sacred resource. From his point of view, it should be preserved above all else, and using it for any kind of conflict is bad, period. There is no fine print, no additional morality there. It doesn't matter who it is or what kind of greater good they believe they're fighting for. Wan Shi Tong simply does not allow it. From his point of view, Zhao and Aang are one and the same. It doesn't matter if Aang is fighting to free the world of oppression, what matters is that he is fighting. And it's that exact trait that makes him even spookier. Because on one hand, he doesn't care about people at all. He offers them this trade and lets them peruse his collection as much as they want. But at the same time, he is also capable of completely destroying the library as soon as he learns that his rules have indeed been broken. Well, I guess he's technically not like destroying the library, but you get the idea. I mean, if you want to take that one step further, look at Wan Shi Tong siding with Unalaq over the belief that he is a better supporter of spirits than the Avatar. For Wan Shi Tong, it is very simple. Are you using his knowledge wisely? No? Then you're bad. Are you fighting someone with said knowledge? Yes? Then you're bad. To be fair though, he also flipped very quickly after realizing that Unalaq is just using him. But if anything, I think that even more so illustrates that bizarre morality and way of going about things we see with the spirits. Even this all-knowing spirit can be duped so long as that transaction of information takes place. They have these almost obsessive rules, but at the same time, they also have their own blind spots. We see something very similar in the Kyoshi era too. The Dao Fei group, Paper Knives, yoinked a book from Wan Shi Tong's library containing information on how to traverse the royal palace. Their goal was to attack the then ruling Earth King, but upon learning of the missing tome, Wan Shi Tong dispatched the knowledge seekers to alert Kyoshi. Not really because of the attack, but more so because the information was unjustly stolen. And on that note, let us talk about how information is presented in this episode, the overarching narrative throughout Book 2 and 3, as well as how all of that ties into our own world. At its core, I think the library emphasizes the relationship between information and power. Information asymmetry, or unequal access to knowledge, is a catalyst for conflict.
Knowledge is power.
Sozin learned of the comet, something that would empower the Fire Nation tenfold, and he used that to jumpstart his war machine that then cascaded into even more technological advancements, all of which enabled this war. It was just a tiny piece of information that made him realize that he could have this small edge in a potential conflict. And because he immediately jumped on this opportunity, well, that just cascaded into what we see in the series. Zhao learned of the Moon Spirit and a way to completely disarm the Waterbenders. Using that information, he launched an attack on the Northern Water Tribe. An attack that, by all accounts, should be impossible. They didn't have stronger forces, they naturally had the debuff of going up against defenders, and they didn't even have like an overwhelming number of forces. All they had was a crucial bit of information that completely upset the balance of power. Even characters like Hama, she discovered bloodbending, a technique that transcends any kind of conventional bending, but immediately after escaping, used it for nothing more than vengeance. Why? Because she can. When a bender meets a bender, there is a risk of harm for both. It is effectively mutually assured destruction that eliminates any chance of conflict. But as soon as that balance is upset, all it takes is one slightly unhinged individual to, slay the moon. The only solution to that is to create this singular beacon of knowledge accessible to all that, as the legends suggest, is meant for people to better themselves. Regardless of how dangerous that information may be, if everyone has access to it, no one, or rather everyone, which means no one, can take advantage of it. But that in and of itself is also a problem because that idea is brilliant on paper, but in reality, people are ignorant. Characters like, again, Zhao might be well informed about the moon spirits, but he is completely ignorant about the long-term effects of throwing the world out of balance. Even while having this ancient spirit's knowledge at his fingertips, Zhao simply refuses to truly learn about that. Same goes for characters like Long Feng. He has access to what's going on in the rest of the world. He knows full well that the Fire Nation is overthrowing other Earth Kingdom settlements. But even so, he still allies with Azula, which, as expected, backfires almost immediately. Ditto for the Northern Water Tribe, that too holds on to those antiquated beliefs about women and waterbending, despite knowing full well that a war is raging on their very doorstep. All of these, and so many other characters, have access to wealths of information, but for one reason or another, they simply refuse to use it. And the absolute trippiest part of all of this to me is how this magical library idea translates one for one to the real world. We might not have a cool-looking old god Big Owl, but we absolutely have a library containing, if not all, then a majority of humanity's knowledge. One that doesn't even require you to traverse a desert, and one that is available to you at this very moment. Know what that place is called? The internet. I doubt this was intentional, considering the internet was still a weird and wacky place back in 2006, but it's crazy to me how true the idea of this library is in our own world. We have this breadth of information available to us at all times. But just like the oasis that had mostly fallen into ruin since the war started, a vast majority of the population, myself included, don't ever really use that incomprehensible amount of information. Each and every one of us, we just have a lot of things going on. There's not a lot of time for just curiosity. We might not be slaying the moon, but we are all busy. We don't have a lot of time, so we are selfish with that information. We only ever use it to further our own personal goals, and that is it. Not being ignorant and being truly curious about the world is, in many ways, a luxury. Also, side note, isn't it like incredibly depressing that the education system basically kills a child's curiosity? How come I learned English at the age of 5 by myself while playing World of Warcraft, but I never even properly got the basics of a third language that I had to take in school? And while we're still talking about real-world parallels, let's not forget Zhao burning the part of the library that contains information on the Fire Nation. First off, that is just human ignorance manifested. In his own ignorance, in his own selfishness, he robs future generations of being able to learn from history. In his mind, no one should ever be able to exercise an informational advantage over the Fire Nation. But ironically, he robs his own nation from that too. Yes, the Dragonbone catacombs do exist, but as we hear in The Reckoning of Roku, it is nowhere near as comprehensive as Wan Shi Tong's library. So, in trying to protect his own nation, he actually hurts them. But number 2, this again very much mirrors our own history. Unfortunately, even in historical context, YouTube tends to be extremely strict, so I'll have to use some TikTok language here. But in the 1930s, the German Student Union held a campaign to burn books. Initially, they targeted books that they viewed as opposition for their ideology, but eventually it led to burning just about any book that just didn't align with their beliefs. We of course all know how that story ends. Even in more recent times, they might not be burned, but there are still many banned books for a variety of reasons. But point is, this kind of human ignorance, this desire to control the narrative, To hold on to power is something that has always existed, exists today, and unless we all merge with the Matrix or something, will likely exist until the end of time. Informed people will always be able to make better decisions than ones with incomplete, no access, or perhaps intentionally withheld information. We see this with Zhao, who read a clickbait headline and got punted by a primordial being. We see this with Ba Sing Se and the population not even knowing that they're being served up to the Fire Nation on a silver platter, and even on the opposite side, this is true for the entire Fire Nation. Remember that this is a cartoon that aired on Nickelodeon? Yeah, they were cooking big time. And while we're still in the library and talking about these things that have been lost to time, the sheer breadth of potential stories that this episode spawns is insane. Even within the series itself, Aang sees the lion turtles, which of course end up being instrumental in the series finale. And that is basically just a throwaway line. In The Reckoning of Roku, Wan Shi Tong talks plenty about styles of firebending that have been forgotten even by the royal family. On top of that, after almost 20 years of being just a theory, we also get the confirmation that blue fire is indeed just hotter flames. Which then begs the question of, has Azula been here? We hear of lightning bending, and more importantly, lightning redirection that has been derived from waterbenders. Which, number one, begs the question of, has Iroh been to the library? Or did he actually just rediscover the style himself somehow? Keep in mind that this is a story about a young Sozin. Iroh is not even born, but the redirection technique is already described. And that also leads to Numero 2. Again, even having access to such information, Ozai never knew of it, with him being completely blindsided by both Zuko and Aang. But that could also be a mistake, or maybe even a retcon. The book already had some mistakes, some of them were fixed, but maybe this was just one that, I don't know why they just kept it in there. Iroh was supposed to be the dude who figured it out, so maybe if it wasn't actually Iroh who figured it out himself, but just like rediscovered the same technique, that should have maybe been made a bit more clear, that it's like an ancient different style, but I don't know, I think it's just a retcon / mistake. Sozin also reads about combustion bending, about the flying technique we see with Zhang Zhang and Ozai, and even about the dragon breathing techniques. And all of that happens within the space of a single paragraph. Even if you want to, totally fair by the way, say that the novels are only like half canon since they're not written by Mike and Brian themselves, they are still overlooked by them, I think the idea that is illustrated here is brilliant. Literally a single character coming to this library could spark an entire story. They could uncover things that we have never seen in other parts of the universe for the simple reason of those texts just being lost to time. I mean, you could even pull a One Piece and introduce a void century of missing history and write a whole story around that. And the best part is that the further back you go, the more interesting the library becomes. And I think the planetarium is the perfect example of that.
Is a true marvel, a mechanical wonder.
If we loop back to that sense of surreal wonder as we see the endless floors of the library, the existence of this incredibly advanced machinery immediately makes you ask, what kind of other rooms might be here? Does Wan Shi Tong almost transcend time with the stuff he can put together? This place just exists. This is the same sort of tier of technology we see in the series, so yeah, you could put together something like this. But because this is like a hub of most of the knowledge in the world, isn't there a very, very good chance that he operates like multiple years into the future compared to the rest of the world? That is how science is done. People learn about things and realize that there are connections that previously hadn't been seen before. That is that vignette world building that Avatar absolutely excelled in. We take these brief strolls into the spirit world, we see the occasional landmarks with purposely incomplete stories, and we meet characters with very ambiguous pasts. All of which just create a sense of a much larger world that we are yet to explore. I made a whole video talking about why I think this is Korra's absolute biggest failure, because I seriously don't know who thought going from majestic old god figures to cuddly plushies was a good idea. But point is, the library absolutely nails that sense of there always being just something more around the corner. It seems very, very easy to do on paper. I mean, just write a big thing and don't explain it. But most of the time, they will simply seem like sloppily written stories with no resolutions, and people will complain about dropped plot lines. To actually create that sense of curiosity while still being satisfying is incredibly difficult. And I really can't think of that many stories that walk that line well. Again, even later installments of Avatar itself fail at this. And yet another thing we need to talk about are the knowledge seekers. In classic Avatar fashion, we don't know what they are, how they were created, or why they really do anything at all, since they also don't seem to serve Wan Shi Tong directly, but rather just work in and around the library. That said, I do have my own personal little theory. In this episode, we see Professor Zay stay behind, and later in Korra, his fate is confirmed as, well, how do I put this? Dead. So my headcanon is that the true scholars who gave their life to research, or perhaps this library itself, are the knowledge seekers. Most other spirits have some kind of distinct features, whereas the knowledge seekers all seem to be parts of a greater whole. All of them, just like scholars, contribute teeny tiny pieces to the greater progress that is research and humanity's combined knowledge. Might be me overanalyzing, but again, that's exactly what this episode does so incredibly well. It is a weird, magical library that was manifested in the middle of a desert by an ancient spirit. It's only natural that you want to get to the bottom of things, but you never do, and that's what makes it great. But alas, as Wan Shi-tong learns that the gang too is just seeking knowledge that would enable the attack on the Fire Nation, he goes full spirit mode, and we get one of the most disturbing lines in the entire show.
At least I'll have one specimen to add to my collection.
Like, bro, leave Momo alone, you eldritch weirdo. Jokes aside though, even as a non-combative spirit, his weird, contorted form is the stuff of nightmares. He creeps around corners while still having this imposing stature. Perhaps not on the scale of Ko or Heibai, but definitely one that could slam you in the face with a very nasty beak. In terms of design though, I think this is exactly how spirits should be portrayed, and not some weird Minecraft glass panes. If anything, I wish we got to see even more of this twisted side of Wan Shi-tong as he rules over his domain. Anytime we get to interact with these ancient figures whose perspectives are so completely different from ours, I just can't help but be creeped out, and I love it. But much more importantly, if you recall what we talked about at the start of the video and how this trek through the desert is what makes that entire revelation feel earned, well, there is a whole lot more. You know what they say, no pain, no gain, right? Just as Wan Shi-tong begins to sink his library, with some weird spirit magic by the way, it kinda looks like airbending, but it's not really airbending. It could also be sandbending, but it's not really sandbending. Toph and Appa are attacked on the outside of the library. One thing that immediately needs to be noted here, Toph holding up the library is all capital letters, bolded and highlighted red. Insane. I'm glad Avatar doesn't have a lot of power scalers, because I think power scaling a inexperienced sandbender earthbending a building of this size while also effectively fighting off a spirit is, well, insane. But Appa being taken here is that price to be paid. It obviously has nothing to do with Wan Shi-tong himself, but the gang broke his rules, and this is the price. We might now have a concrete date for when the Fire Nation will be at their weakest, but suddenly, we are at our weakest. We flew all the way over here. Appa was our big reverse Uno to even make this journey possible, and suddenly, that is gone. And like, one thing I don't even quite know how to put into words, but the way everything fits together here is so smooth. We travel across this massive desert for an ancient library. Cool, makes sense. We find the library, but Appa doesn't go in because he's afraid of tight spaces. And Toph doesn't go in because, well, a library isn't really useful to her because, you know, she can't exactly read.
What's this? What's with you people? I'm blind!
And then Appa being captured while Toph is forced to just hold up the library, it all works so well together. Book 1 had this linear goal of getting to the Northern Water Tribe and the overarching warning of Sozin's comets. But everything in between was sort of us just jumping all over the place. Book 2, on the other hand, was a little more ambiguous. We didn't really have a huge goal, especially after meeting Toph. But in this single episode, the rest of the story is set in motion. From Aang's mourning and the complete shift in his perspective as a bender, to getting to the Earth King and all the drama that entails, to mustering our forces, to the Day of the Black Sun itself, and even technically bringing down Ozai, all of that is introduced in this single episode. So while I might have been yapping about a whole lot of implications from the library and extra Avatar stories, there are equally many that don't even need to be yapped about because that is what happens as a direct result of this. And another side note, in the long run, Toph training in sandbending to the point that she goes from basically zero to being able to recreate Ba Sing Se in a single move is yet another direct outcome of this. From her perspective, it was her inability, her failure as a bender that caused Appa's kidnapping. And so, she trains and trains until she masters even sandbending that, let's be real, it's pretty useless. Except it is not, because what is sand?
Hey, Vsauce! Michael here.
Well, it is tiny, tiny speckles of earth that require great precision, as seen by the Ba Sing Se replica. And what does metal bending need? Yup, being able to zero in on tiny, refined bits of earth. So, if you're an over-analysis enjoyer, I think there's a very good argument to be made that the loss of Appa and Toph's eventual training in sandbending is what enables her ability to metal bend. As we hear from Sozin in The Reckoning of Roku, knowledge of one's ability is not enough. It requires rigorous training. That is why Sozin never did like lightning bending and all the other combustion techniques and everything else. It's just too much work. It doesn't matter just how big brain Toph is in realizing that metal is just cooler earth. To actually act on that realization requires great skill, which in this case just so happens to line up with sandbending. But with that, we close off this episode with just a single tear rolling down Aang's cheek. Just as we reached our absolute peak in terms of knowledge and capabilities, all of that is torn down in an instant. I think the library's greatest strength is writing a compelling conflict with little to no conflict. At the heart of this episode is pursuit of information. That is it. We don't necessarily need to get to a certain location or fight a certain enemy. All we need are just maps or intel on the Fire Nation. It is a story about pursuing knowledge, the dangers of ignorance, and the price of both. And so, we go on this quest that shows us the learning process. There is no inherent conflict, but it is a journey. We meet this ancient spirit and peruse his endless collection, inadvertently stumbling upon the day of the eclipse. But that does not give us an immediate edge. Instead of introducing conflict over a particular piece of information, think Azula capturing Katara just as Aang is about to master the Avatar states, the show instead introduces this completely new plot of losing Appa that then throws the entire story upside down. There is basically no fighting, it just happens and we are left to deal with the consequences. There is no overarching villain. This is one of very few episodes with no B-plots. Zuko is not chasing him, Azula is not chasing him, no one's chasing him. Yet it still deals, if not the most, then one of the most painful hits on not just Team Avatar, but Aang individually. It is an episode that sparks so much curiosity, but also so much pain, because we know what happens to Aang after this. The single most important bit of information in the entire show is completely undermined by just loss. So with all that being said, from the spirits to Toph's metal bending to conveying the journey of learning of the eclipse, I believe this is Book 2's single most important episode. And just to add a little small touch of chaos here at the end, because the Netflix version has already moved Wan Shi Tong to Season 1, I'll also just add that the desert and the library as a location for us to learn of the eclipse are crafted perfectly, and taking those away would seriously undermine literally the rest of the series. That is all. And that's the video. Actually, speaking of the live-action version, now that Season 2 is getting back into production, there is a whole bunch of news about casting and everything else coming out, all of which I'm covering on the second channel. There are very good developments, but based on a few things I'm hearing, there is also a lot of stuff to be really worried about. But yes, if you want to know more, I cover all of that on Korotos TV, that is my second channel, linked in the description. And another thing, I'm playing around with the idea of live streaming every single day of September on, again, my second channel and on Twitch. So again, give that a look if you're interested. No promises, I'm not guaranteeing that it's going to happen, but that's just an idea. Other than that, I want to say a massive thank you to our current patrons and YouTube members who allow me to produce even more of these for you all. And let's also give a warm welcome to the newest member of the team, Matthew Lee. Without you, there'd be a whole lot less of my rambling, so seriously, thank you. Other than that, I want to say thank you very much for watching, I hope you have a great day, and hopefully, I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye!